Hello, sir. Welcome to our channel Pen Name. My name is Harshita. It's an honor to be in conversation with you, sir. I will firstly start with a small introduction about you. Sir Ritvik Datta is an environmental lawyer who's playing a major role in campaigning for environmental justice. He's one of the founder and managing trustee of LIFE, Legal Initiative for Forest and Environment. He's an Ashoka Fellow and recipient of many prestigious awards. He has fought more than 350 cases in support of communities, civil society groups, and citizens challenging the environment and forest clearance. He initially graduated in sociology and law from the University of Delhi. He also has a diploma in environmental law. He has authored 13 books on environmental law, including the book Supreme Court on Forest Conservation and National Green Tribunal. Sir Life, his firm, Legal Initiative for Forest and Environmental Law, has won this year's Right Livelihood Award, also called Sweden's Alternative Nobel. Congratulations, sir.
Thank you.
So with this small introduction, I welcome you, sir, again. So for my first question, it's a normal question you've been asked a lot of times. So what inspired you to become an environmental lawyer? Is there any specific incident or a reason that inspired you to pursue this career path?
For me, my interest in the field of environmental law was not really the first interest. I had a deep interest in wildlife and nature. So I started off at a fairly young age, being passionate about wildlife conservation, wild animals, birds. These have been what really something which I have always been interested in. I developed an interest in that subject. Over time, I started looking at wildlife related issues. But, somewhere down the line, I also realized one of the important thing for me was definitely the interest in wildlife. But I also saw that, one of the greatest threat facing wildlife is loss of habitat. Poaching is a problem. But, what happens when the entire habitat vanishes? And to that extent, I found that, law could be an effective tool, to protect areas, wild rivers, all of this. So it basically became, a profession, but also in order to further my own, interest. That's how I went into the domain of environmental law.
Okay, sir. So it won't be wrong if I say that India has been in the forefront when it comes to environmental protection, owing to provide judicial and administrative remedies for the victims. Being a country that has a separate environmental justice system by establishment of National Green Tribunal, where do you think we stand today globally as a country with respect to redressal of environmental issues?
See, with the coming in of the National Green Tribunal in 2010, I think we definitely are at a much better state than many other countries of the world. There's no, even as country and as in comparison. So most countries don't have an effective environmental courts. Even where they do have environmental courts, they're at a much lower level. They have limited jurisdiction and at somewhere around the district level. Our environmental court is fairly high in the status. It is headed by a former judge of the Supreme Court. It has former judges of the High Court as members. So an expert member. So it's fairly high. So if you look at it at the theoretical basis, we are at a very advantageous stage when you compare it with other countries of the world. There is though a wide gap between what exists on paper and what gets implemented. Now that's a different ball. But otherwise, I think with the coming or setting up of the National Green Tribunal, you have an institutional mechanism for redressal of grievances with regard to environment. And that's very, very important.
I want to know what is the common challenge that advocates face while fighting for an environmental cause or a wildlife cause in Supreme Court or in NGT anywhere?
See, there are many challenges. The first and foremost challenge that we face is that it's always a race against time. Our law says that, moment a project is approved, you have a maximum of 90 days to challenge the project. Right? You have maximum 90 days from the date on which the approval is granted. Now, so unlike many other jurisdiction, it's a very tough one. And it's not also that you have 90 days. Usually it comes when you have only about 15 days, 20 days before the time goes. So you have to actually prepare your petition within such a short period of time, and and the variety of issues and the issues across the country are so varied, are so diverse, that it's impossible for any lawyer, irrespective of the level of specialization, to actually prepare a petition within such a short period of time. That's the first basic problem that we face.
Problem.
The second very important is about the inputs that come from the ground. You see, you have to prepare based on what is on paper, but a lot of information is also factual, right? You have to go and get those information from the ground. So as an environmental lawyer, you need not actually be sitting in your chamber and looking at papers. It invariably involves you going to the field to study the situation itself. Third is actually when you argue the matter, whether it's an environmental court or it's a high court or a Supreme Court, you are against a lot of challenges in front of you. Firstly, normally the judges are not in favor of you, right? They generally do tend to see that anyone who's challenging a project is trying to hinder the so-called development of the country. They don't normally see that what somebody is trying to do is protect the environment and to prevent destruction of environment. They see that as somebody who has come to block something that is good happening to the country. Most of them don't see that the good is in the existing situation. You have forests there existing, you have wildlife, you have rivers flowing. That is the best thing. That is what development is about. If nature is at its pristine level, that is ultimate stage of development. Ultimately, the judges don't see that mostly. They see that, here is one fellow who has come to create nuisance, right? And, they will be representing people who are again, a nuisance in the society. They see you with a lot of suspicion. That's the biggest challenge you face. You are challenging lawyers who on the opposite side, who have much more resources, who have much more technical and legal support than us. But that is still something that we have been able to deal with. And I think the final challenge that we face is, well, winning a case is always a challenge. You don't win cases, but even if you win, getting it implemented is not easy. So you may get a wonderful order which reads so well, and then at the end of it, you are going around with that paper and the judgment, which becomes judicial precedent, but on the ground, nothing has happened. So your work doesn't end with only a judgment. So one of the things that I say in environmental law is there is never a lawyer and client relationship, right? There is always a relationship of partnership. So there is no client. There is somebody who wants to protect it, and somebody as a lawyer who wants to team up with that person.
Also wants to protect it. Correct.
Protect it. So it is always a collaboration of two partners, two people who want to do it. The day it becomes lawyer-client, environmental law practice is over.
Well said, sir. So, since we all know, you've fought more than 350 cases so far. Some of them require taking on companies like Vedanta, Lafarge, Jindal Steel, POSCO, etc., many others, which were challenging and have made a great impact with their judgments also. If you walk us through the cases that were challenging and also tell us about the fights that are close to your heart or personal.
Okay, let me just make just an update. The 350 figure was about 7 years back, right? Okay, so currently we have more than 1,000 cases that we have done. In fact, we sometimes lose count of it, but it's more than 1,000. And, each case is a story in itself, whether we win or lose. In fact, there are more stories in the cases that one does not succeed, because you feel bad that despite having so many facts in your favor, you still did not get a judgment in your favor. That's the tragedy. So, a lot of stories get written. A lot of news coverage happens about cases that one has won. But I would also say that the cases that one has lost are also very important stories that need to be told, because there are no judgments which actually give the right perspective. So those stories are there. Now, if I look at it here, right from Vedanta onwards, each one is a story. Now I can share with you, say, POSCO, right? It was the single largest direct investment in the history of India. We challenge it, and when you look at all these big projects, the project's investment may be high, but the quality of documents that they prepare are so shoddy. So it is not just the private entities that prepare shoddy documents, it is also the government, which allows such documents to be, accepted. So if I give you an example of POSCO, it was the single largest direct foreign investment in the history of India. When we challenge it, we found that, they were required to do under India's EIA law, a ground level survey of flora and fauna, right? They are supposed to do a ground because they are ultimately setting up a steel plant and thousands of acres of land are involved. Now here, the company that did the EIA, right, ML Dastur and company and others, many other entities were involved. All the studies that they did, none of them actually did a ground level survey, right? And in fact, they wrote later, the project proponent, that a detailed ground level survey was done by a low flying helicopter, right? Now, how do you study ground level flora and fauna
through a
by,
helicopter?
having a low flying helicopter, however low it is? Similarly, the same project went ahead, and said that, in respect of the impact of turtles, because, there were important nesting grounds for olive ridley turtles.
Correct.
It's in Orissa. POSCO project is in Orissa. It is in very close to Gahirmata and all the areas where turtle and olive ridley come. They say with regard to the olive ridley turtle, a telephone call was made to the chief wildlife warden, who informed that no impact will take place. So that's all. Only a telephone call was made, right? And that became the basis on which they gave a green signal to the project. This is the level at which, projects were getting approved. Very recently, if you look at even highway projects across the country, National Highway number 7, it bifurcates and divides the Kanha-Pench corridor, one of the most important tiger. Nearly 30% of tigers in India are in this belt. A highway comes up in that area. And when they want to expand the National Highway number 7, the forest department is supposed to fill up the form, right, and disclose as to whether there are endangered species of flora and fauna. They fill it up by stating that no rare species of wild flora and fauna were found at the time of inspection, right? Now, you have an area which is next to a national park. It is touching the Pench Tiger Reserve. They wonderfully write that no endangered species of wild flora and fauna were found at the time of inspection. They're right. Now, if you conduct an inspection at 12 o'clock in the afternoon in a tiger reserve, it's right. Even if you go to the core area of the best tiger reserve with the best density, you will not see, because they don't mention when did the inspection happen, who conducted the inspection, and what is the time. Now, if I go to the roads of Delhi at 2 o'clock at night, I say, well, Delhi is a wonderful place. People drive wonderfully. There's no car density there. There's one car that crosses every 10 minutes. We don't need any expansion of roads. Now, this is the kind of, information that is not only accepted, it is rewarded, right? So anybody who fills up this information, nobody questions them. And the story there is, we lost NH7 case, even after all this information. You see, recently there was this case called Ganeshpur Dehradun Highway, the litigation going on. There, they noticed that 37 different leopards were noticed in that area. And yet they come and clear the project saying there is no threatened, rare and endangered species, even though they mention elephants, leopards are found in the particular site. So when you look at cases like this, in almost every instance, in fact, just to share with you, our first interest in EIA started, in fact, way back in somewhere around 2004, 2005, where we found an EIA report which a local community had approached us to challenge, relating to a limestone mining project in the Ratnagiri, right, in Maharashtra. Now, what was very interesting about it is that, we critiqued the report. We sent to one of our partner groups, whom we are part of a network called ELAW. They looked at the EIA report, and that there's something very interesting in the report, right? And what they found very interesting in the report is that, every single indicator with regard to chemical composition of the rivers, water composition, chemical composition, BOD, COD, exactly tallied with a river in Russia. Right? Now, only the name of the river was different. They did a further check, and when they found that they mentioned that the main species of reptiles found in Ratnagiri is the Siberian salamander.
Oh.
Right? So they copied it from Siberia for some limestone project. And the what was finally the nail in the coffin was the fact that they said that in terms of their social commitment, the project proponent commits that they will not use any prison laborers from Siberia. Now this is a project. The sad part is, we lost the case because according to the court, we did not come within the stipulated 90 days. And that particular project today is up and running despite giving such fraudulent information. This is the problem that happens across. We succeeded when it came to other projects. Say, for example, in Arunachal, the Nyamjangchu hydroelectric project was ultimately stopped by the National Green Tribunal because they never disclosed the presence of the black neck crane in the submergence area of the project site itself. It was a successful case, but it's stories where information is concealed. So there, the EI report was prepared. They never disclosed that, they collected only summer data, whereas these birds come for wintering in India. So obviously, if you collect summer data, you will not get winter data. Okay. And so today, the entire process is faulty because of this. So I can go on, but I can definitely tell you that, these are some of the instances which are there, and there are a long list of it. But
so clearly the assessment is not going for the protection of the environment.
The thing is that if today we make any such wrong disclosure while submitting a passport application, your passport will not only be rejected, you will be debarred from applying for a passport for the next 5-10 years. Right? Unfortunately, projects worth thousands of crores, get approved based on such fraudulent information. And when they get caught, they say, well, we want to bring, we want to develop, it is for the development of the nation. Well, I can also give forged information to get a passport, go abroad and say, well, I'm going to remit money back to the country. That's also for development. We have two different rules for two different set of violators. The more money you put in, your violation is condoned. The lesser money you have, you are a criminal. That's it.
So there has to be steps taken for making the law strict regarding the process.
The law is there. I'll tell you very honestly, the law is very clear on this. If any information is found incorrect at any stage, they give an undertaking that the clearance given should be revoked at our risk and cost. Unfortunately, neither the administration today nor the judiciary is willing to invoke this clause when it comes to big violators. That is the biggest challenge that we face. The law is absolutely crystal clear. You give a wrong information, your approval granted is to be rejected. That's all.
But you cannot claim that the information is correct and succeed with the fact that the assessment is wrong, even though it is very clear that the assessment is wrong.
Yes.
Also, sir, as we know that media is the greatest source of information now in the digital age. So we have seen that environmental issues are not covered as much in TV or social media as it is covered in the print media. So what do you think is the reason, and how do you think we can change it? Encourage the youth or the young advocates to take up environmental issues?
See, I think I think social media is still very active when it comes to environment. I think I would say that it is gaining ground. In fact, the whole campaign against the changes and the dilution in the EIA process, a lot of credit goes to the social media campaign that happened. Because we have to keep in mind that for bulk of environmental issues, you cannot expect a protest in the nature of farm laws, like where you can have hundreds of people. It can happen in cases like dams, where in Narmada Bachao Andolan to others, there have been public protests of large numbers. But at the same time, I think it is very critical to understand that we are not only about numbers here. It's also about the quality of critics. Sometimes, laws have been, changes or dilution have been stopped because there was one good article by one good journalist. That's all. You don't need 1 million followers, or you don't need 1 million hits and Twitter shares and all. It can be done. What is very, very critical is what is the quality of investigation that one is doing. So whether it is the youth, whether it's the social media as a tool, or whether it is print media, what really matters is the quality of investigation, the quality of expose. What is the kind quality that we are giving people? And if it is strong critique, it can stop a project. It can stop a dilution. Like today, the Biodiversity Act has been diluted. It has been made redundant. Now, before going in for a social media campaign, my first point would be, let's read the law, right? Identify where it is faulty. And there can be just one or two critiques also, which can expose the manner in which the government is today trying to benefit a select group of large pharmaceutical and herbal industry to the detriment of the local community who's protecting and conserving. But I think more than anything else, it needs us to understand, the designs of the government, the designs of the corporates. And for that, it's important to have numbers, but it's equally much more important to focus on the quality of critique.
True. So since you already touched upon this topic, I think you will agree that the executive administration in our country with respect to implementation is not as effective as it should be. So what do you think or suggest changes or improvements that are needed in this area with respect to administration in the smaller level or the lower level?
See, my first and foremost point, which I've been trying to say a lot, not been successful at it, is that we don't have a dedicated service to look at environment itself. You have a forest service, Indian Forest Service, which is essentially trained in silvicultural operations, right? It is trained how to plant a tree and how to cut a tree. That's the core. That's why they love compensatory afforestation, because they believe that any amount of tree that you cut, you can recreate forest. So we don't have, say, for example, a service which looks at the diversity of issues concerning environment. There's no service that looks at environmental pollution. There's no service that looks at climate change. We need to actually have a completely different service which incorporates wildlife conservation, forest conservation, environment protection, and biodiversity conservation. We are a country where we consider biodiversity as separate, forests as separate, environment is separate, and yet we have only one service to look at all of them. Mm-hmm. So an Indian Forest Service officer gets appointed as a member secretary of the Pollution Control Board, as the chairman of the Biodiversity Board, as chief wildlife warden, and in charge of a zoo. So suddenly,
so from managing a zoo, can be.
So we don't have, the IFS may call itself as a specialized, but it is only a basic administrative service with a very basic training to look at forest only. Mm-hmm. So how do you expect someone to look at, say, a Himalayan black bear or a tiger in a zoo and next day monitors NOx and SOx pollution, right? Correct. And PM 2.5, it's too diverse. There's a judgment to that effect of the Supreme Court of the NGT, authored by Forest Service officers themselves, stating that, Indian Forest Service officers are not trained in the subject of environment. Mm-hmm. Right? They themselves write in the judgment saying we are not trained. They put the whole curriculum and said we have no training in environment. It is only out of personal interest that somebody reads about it and becomes a knowledgeable person. But otherwise, we today are in a state where we have no trained human resource, or trained manpower, human resource, whatever one can call it, to actually administer the subject of environment.
So that should be our step forward.
Absolutely. We need, I always say we need a new Environment and Forest Service. We can call it Environment, Forest and Wildlife Service, or an Indian Ecology Service, or an Indian Nature Service. But managing entire area based on an Indian Forest Service model, which is of the British era, is not, can never
Be as
really
efficient as we
solve
want
our
it to be.
environmental problems today.
Correct, sir. So coming to development, sir. So the sustainable development is the most commonly used word in the process of, say, encroaching the forest area or building infrastructure by encroaching various lakes and river streams that have been formed over the years. What is the actual meaning of sustainable development, and how far do you think it is being used properly in the right sense?
Let me tell you, sustainable development is a myth.
Hmm.
It's a fiction. It doesn't exist in real life. Right from Stockholm to Rio to all, they've been talking about sustainable development. What happens is that in order to bind people together, in order to group them together towards a common mission, you actually create certain myths and fiction. You create what, Yuval Harari has said, an imposed order. So he's called all these concepts. Actually, he's not used the word sustainable development, but if you look at it, many of these laws, institutions actually further certain myths and fiction. Sustainable development is a fiction. The way that it is there, it nowhere, look at every single judgment of the Supreme Court. When they've used the word sustainable development, they've actually used it to destroy the environment. And in nowhere, I have yet to come across any writer, any researcher, any scientific document which says, well, this society is sustainable or this country is sustainable. So therefore, if they can give an example that which is the society in the modern age, you see, you can have forest dependent community, you can have tribal societies which have sustained themselves. But in today's development model, how do you sustain an ecology when you don't want to do mining in 90% of the forest area? You want to construct roads, you want to construct highways. It's a word that you have to use in everything. It is a word that you have to use without understanding what it means, because let me tell you, it doesn't mean anything. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising. What is the yardstick? How do you look at it? How do you measure it? And do you undermine the environmental requirement of the present? How do you know that this will be the future needs? So it is actually a myth. It is actually a fiction. It is basically
just a facade behind all the work that is being done for the destruction of environment, so to say.
See, everywhere you look at the recent judgments that have come out from the Supreme Court or the NGT, how, whether it is an airport, they said, well, we need sustainable development, but where is that balancing?
Correct.
Where is it? So in reality, there's not been giving, nobody has been able to give example of societies which are industrial in nature, which are sustainable. There is no, they've not been able to show that, okay, even after doing so much of mining, even after doing, blocking every single rivers, we can actually call ourselves sustainable. There's nothing. So it is basically, moving from every judgment, every decision will say sustainable development. Now they add the word climate change. They don't understand it. Climate change is a reality. Sustainable development is a myth. Let's put it here. And every single decision today that you see are justified on the ground of sustainable development. They are not evaluated in terms of climate change. So when you build in infrastructure, right, in the coastal area, they say sustainable development. They don't say, well, how will it help or how will it aggravate the climate risk that these areas are facing? No, because, it's always good to escape from the reality and go into the domain of myth and fiction. So therefore, when you have big dams in the Himalayas, they are not going to say, well, this is going to make us more vulnerable to impacts of climate change. They will say, well, this is sustainable development.
That is the case in most of the cities also, no, sir, now. That many areas where there were lakes or river streams, that was a stream for the rivers or the lakes to go and join the ocean. You've cut down those areas and built houses. So it is bound that those areas are a little low and water is bound to come there. And we saw a lot of problems recently with the cyclone where many houses were filled with water and people couldn't, go out, or the cars were drowned. So this is all a part of sustainable development, which is not so sustainable right now.
It is never. And let me tell you, there is no way they can achieve sustainability. The reason for that is that one of the yardstick of defining sustainability is, let's be honest, let's disclose what is the true impact of a particular project. Nobody is willing to look at the true environmental impact of a particular project. It is like given, like this project will come out, will come in. Now you decide on what should be done. You plant 5 trees here, paint the walls green, do everything possible, ensure that, recycle water is put in. Now, these are very small steps. These are not sustainable. The entire area vanishes. That's what sustainability is about. Are you willing to protect an entire area and a forest and not go into greenwashing? Sustainable development is essentially a part of the greenwashing exercise.
Sir, also, like I mentioned in the introduction, you have authored 13 books, one of which is the Supreme Court on Forest Conservation and National Green Tribunal. What was the inspiration behind the book? Also, if you can give a small insight on the book.
So, 2 of the books are there. One is the Supreme Court on Forest Conservation, which I have, edited and wrote in 2004, right? Okay. And one of the reasons for writing that book was essentially realizing that, with my co-author, Mr. Bhupender Yadav, who is currently the Environment Minister of India, right? We were together and at one time in 2004, and we used to look at a lot of cases on forest coming out. But at that time, neither the websites nor the electronic media actually covered these judgments, these interim orders. So every Friday, the Supreme Court's forest bench would sit and pass numerous orders on forest. But none of the big, publication house, whether SCC and others, would even cover these judgments. Also, there's no way you could go online and check them, because 2003-04, none of this information was available online. Correct. So we decided to actually come out with a book to compile all the judgments, all the decisions, all the interim orders in one place, so that forest officers, activists, institutions, organizations, whoever wants to use this forest, this information to save forest, to protect wildlife, could actually use it. So I'm happy that, we came out. When we first negotiated with Universal Law Publishers, they said, well, who is going to take this book? Firstly, it's about one judgment. You're coming with a book about one judgment. The case is still ongoing. Where will be the bias? It needed us to convince them that they not only published it, the first edition went to about 4 reprints. And subsequently, we had 3 editions of the book, right? So right up to 2011 or 12, we came out with editions after edition, 3 editions, and almost like close to 14 to 15 reprints happened. So in a way, it was very significant, because it also showed us that there's a market, and takers for books that cover environment, and not only environment, forest, and not only forest, one judgment of the Supreme Court, that is TN Godavari. So that is that. With regard to my second book, which was, co-authored with Mr. Sanjit Purohit, who was a lawyer in Jodhpur, was basically when the NGT came in, people didn't know what the NGT is about. So we thought, let us start with a book so that, people have books accessible. And we also make this as a commercial venture, because, by making it commercial, you also ensure it is accessible. With a lot of publication done by civil society groups, these are great publication, but the problem is access is limited. You don't know where to get those free publications. For us, because it was available through the largest distributor in the country of law books, anyone, anywhere could pick it up. So this has been my own one and really speaking, both this book does not have too much of my independent assessment or critique. So whether it is essentially a compilation, it is essentially an edited version of various judgments, so that anybody can actually use it, to have a better understanding and use it in their litigation. So it's essentially to serve as a tool more than an academic publication.
Lastly, sir, what is your advice for young advocates like me who are just starting their practice?
I think, environmental law is a great area to practice, and the country needs environmental lawyers, and there is going to be no dearth of issues coming to you. So my point today is, and 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 focus on volumes. Don't say that, I'll take up 5 cases and concentrate on 5 cases for the next 5 years. No, it's not going to work. Prepare more cases. Yeah, you have to take up more cases, and don't worry about money. Initially 1-2 years in anyone, whether you're a criminal lawyer, whether in the commercial side also, you'll not earn money. Here, start off, put in 2 years of your life, and you'll get a great amount of satisfaction, even with after losing so many cases, because you've at least raised your voice. You've actually become a voice for people and the environment. And somewhere down the line, for every one case that you lose, those who have somehow managed to escape because of you losing the case will at least be careful in the future. So there's many more areas that you have unknowingly saved by taking up one matter. So keep that in mind. Don't let the words of the opposite side influence you. Don't let any statements coming from judges who are not supporting you affect you negatively. Take it as your strength, and stand there. And most important, feel bad when you lose a case, but ensure that it gives you more energy, to fight ahead. And my final advice would be, don't follow others. Don't follow the steps, for example, as I have followed it. Come out with your own way. We have a problem with the profession where we say, well, we'll go by what the seniors have said. Don't do it. Maybe we are following it in the wrong way. Maybe you have a better idea. Come out with innovative ways, come out with creative ways, and come out of the entire judicial precedent that has been set in the 1980s and 90s. We tend to follow the Vellore and the Citizens and Ratlam municipality. Just come out of the precautionary polluter pay principles and sustainable development. Chart out a new course of jurisprudence. So I would just say, look ahead, don't look behind.
Yes.
Don't be disheartened with any laws that happens. Don't be disheartened by any statements that come from opposite side judges and all. Use that to build your strength. Use that to study more. And and most important, I think, represent range of issues. Don't get concentrated in one. Once you decide I want to be an environment lawyer, whether it is toxic matter, whether it is related to air pollution, whether it's related to wildlife, take up all. Don't do too much specialization within the domain of environmental. Because if you're an environmental law, just do all branches of environmental law.
Correct. Okay, sir. It's been very insightful, educational, inspiring. So thank you, sir, for your time and for being available for this interview in your busy schedule. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to interact and wish you all the best.